Shalom everyone, Yo here again with another episode of Tzala Mikra. I hope you enjoyed last week's recording on kosher food, practical kosher food. And yes, that was actually a pre-recorded recording from several months ago, which I did post on my website, but did not post onto other media. And this is why it was actually somewhat overlooked. And I do always strongly recommend go to my website. Don't trust Facebook and don't trust YouTube. The website always contains more information than the other types of media that I have. Though using YouTube is a very, very good tool. But still, I highly recommend go to the website. That's where the real work is done. In any case, this you should know there is a part 2 to this recording, or to that recording actually. That deals with keeping kosher, if I remember correctly, in the house. And I will be posting it sometime in the next week or so. In any case, this week I'm doing, again, a regular recording. And though I actually wanted my wife to join us for this recording because it's about childbirth and different laws that have to do with what happens after childbirth, unfortunately, we are coming close to Chag HaMatzot and Leil Seder, and it becomes kind of hectic in Jewish homes, probably more hectic than other places, though cleaning for Pesach is usually a relatively simple task of removing leaven from the house. However, we take a bit more extreme behavior when it comes to it and really look for everything you can imagine. And specifically if you have children, which is one of the subjects we're going to talk about today, you will have to start going through their pockets. And I personally know from families that, I live this as well, is that kids stuff things into their pockets, or they might hide food, a sandwich they didn't want because it had the wrong filling or whatever it might be, that they might throw somewhere. And believe me, I've found sandwiches and food, and it was not the dog or the cat. It was the child who decided that something did not fit what they wanted, and therefore are not fitting for their consumption and should be discarded in an inappropriate manner. So Naomi unfortunately cannot join us for this recording, though I really do need her insight on this one. But we'll try to maybe do something later on, maybe after Chag HaMatzot, to continue the discussion about practical nidah. Obviously, we're going to talk about Shabbat, and we're going to talk about educating children. And I also want to say thank you to those who wrote and said nice things about the recording we did there. And yes, I do agree that it's very good and very nice to have a woman's perspective on subjects which truly are for women. And yes, I do know that some of the stuff that we mentioned there, some people say was very creepy. But you also need to understand the world that we come from and to realize that not everything that in Western culture is considered to be creepy would be creepy in our culture. And we need to understand that these are different cultures, and people need to realize that cultures are different. And I'm going to repeat the word different over and over again until people get into their heads. There are multiple things that I deal with all the time, with people thinking that something is weird or something is strange, but they're really judging it through their own culture instead of thinking, well, this is their culture and this is how they live. And I find it really peculiar sometimes, these clashes between cultures. And I think the laws of nidah and even the laws of childbirth are one of these issues where it seems to be as if we're treating women as if they're lesser or lower or anything like that. And it's not true. It's just there are certain rules that we go by where we believe that there are spiritual elements. And really, people do believe in spirituality and negative energies and everything. And in Torah, we don't talk about negative energies. If there is something negative in the universe, it has a physical manifestation. And there's a massive oxymoron in Western culture when it comes to acceptance and rejection and then interpretation. And I think that people need to learn these things to understand that whatever they understand is correct or incorrect is diluted and affected by whatever education that they received. And it's very peculiar that people, for example, admire one culture or say we have to be tolerant towards one culture and then another culture we can't. And in both cultures, there are things that contradict Western thought. And this is an oxymoron, maybe even in some places a certain level of hypocrisy. For example, criticism of Israel. And yes, I am Israeli, and I live here, and I served in the IDF, and I'm very proud of my country. And the thing that people, the contradiction that people live by is, on one hand, they attack Jews for protecting themselves or whatever it might be, but then they will go around saying, "Oh, the poor Arabs." And the sad thing about this is that, why are you judging us this way and then treating them the other way? And they'll say, "Oh, because you're supposed to follow our culture." Well, what about them? If your culture says they have to be kind to others, why are you turning a blind eye to what they do in their own culture? There's these contradictions that people live by all the time. And the same thing comes to Torah. You can admire Torah for the beautiful things that appear in it, but then sometimes you're gonna meet something that doesn't fit whatever cultural standard you have, and you're gonna say, "Well, this I can't accept." Either you accept it or you don't. I mean, you can't pick and choose. There's no cherry picking here. And when it comes to laws of Nidah, a lot of people, laws of Nidah and laws of childbirth, which are very, very similar, people feel as if they should be ignored because it demeans women, or it treats women as if there's something wrong with them, and so on. And you have to realize that the Torah exists in the principle of spheres. There are spiritual spheres that exist that conduct and control the way we are to manage ourselves as people. And you need to understand that many of the laws of blood flow are not necessarily something that affect your everyday life. The only actual prohibition that you have when there's a blood flow is the marital act. There's basically you're not supposed to be together at that time. Other than that, it doesn't really affect anything. And this is something that people really miss out on. They don't really understand this. Now, if we lived in a reality where there was a temple, then yes, a person who wants to go to the temple needs to refrain from coming in contact with his wife for at least a day or two before. And we can actually understand that from different cases, like, for example, the revelation of Mount Sinai, that God would appear after the third day. And they had to prepare themselves. They had to bathe themselves, and then they had to clean their clothing. And the reality is that in everyday life, if there's no temple, then you don't really have to live by that. So it really gets narrowed down even more. And you don't find in the Torah, for example, this idea that you have to keep away from them. Even the case of Lavan, where his daughter says to him, "Oach nashimli," I have the way of women, which basically means she's having her cycle. You actually don't see this idea of he can't draw near to her in the sense of giving a hug or something. You only see this idea that she can't stand before him, she can't get up. However, later on we start hearing commentaries that say that they believe that there was something dangerous in the menstrual cycle, or that there's some evil spirit there or something. And in truth, you don't find anything like that in Torah. The Torah is interested in, when it comes to these things, interested in one principle, the temple sphere. In the temple, you can't enter unclean. Now, clean and unclean is a very difficult thing to explain because it's spiritual. And, there might be people who have the ability to see auras, if auras actually exist. And those people might be able to indicate that something is okay or not okay. But on the other hand, the reality is that these things only have implications in the sphere of the temple, where cleanliness and uncleanliness is what's important. And it's very important to point out that the majority if not all the cases that deal with cleanliness and uncleanliness, all belong to some kind of temple text. And when I say temple text, I mean things that can be associated, sections that can be associated with the book of Leviticus, or that they have a Levitical style in them. So, for example, in Numbers, we have a description of elements that have to do with being clean and unclean, and it's the language there suddenly becomes very similar to the language of the book of Leviticus. And actually, people who do document hypothesis, and regardless of the nonsense of the document hypothesis, they did point out one very interesting thing, which there's a style of language and words. And what we see there is that the style suddenly becomes very similar. So they usually associate those sections in Numbers to the priestly writings. The theory itself is ridiculous because it assumes that people write the same way all the time and don't have the ability to create different styles, which is complete nonsense, and everyone understands that. If I write a letter to someone or I write an academic paper, I'm not going to write them the same way. And I'm not going to use the same terminology either. Now, the sphere of the temple is the sphere of holiness. And to be in the presence of holiness, you also have to be clean. And because we don't really have the ability to see the spiritual element that comes with this process of being clean or unclean, we can only understand the physical manifestation of it, and not necessarily feel what it means or have some kind of spiritual insight. And also what's very important is that this is for all of Israel. So there can be people who are more pious and less pious, but everyone has to follow the same rules. So the Torah really only focuses on something that everyone can follow, and not necessarily just the pious or just the great ones. Something which we hear more and more from around the Second Temple, that there are people who are greater and lesser. But the expectancy of the Torah is that you do everything the same. Everyone is under the same rule. And if someone wants to bring these things into their everyday life, where they eat everything that they eat in cleanliness, and they always work in cleanliness, and they never allow any impurity to enter their life, then that's their personal decision. But in overall, I assume here, and again, there's no way of proving this or even disproving it, but as a speculation, it seems to be that people probably just lived their lives and they only prepared for the temple or prepared themselves in cleanliness when they could, or actually when they needed it. And in everyday life, people probably were in a state of uncleanliness most of the time. Now, there are some people who want to argue that the Israelites had temples in different places, and I've pointed this out as well, that it is quite a possibility, but what it doesn't really affect your personal life. You still have to prepare yourself. Even if you have like a local shrine or an altar which is used, we actually find in the book of Samuel that when they ate from the sacrifice, there was a group of people known as the Kru'im, the ones who were summoned, which meant that these were people that probably had to prepare themselves at least a day before to join the meal there that was composed of the sacrificial meat. So even there, even in a situation where we claim that there was a local shrine, you didn't enter the local shrine every day. It was not a synagogue. And people had to check if they're clean or unclean. So the assumption is that unless you paid attention to your state and what you've come in contact and what you've not come in contact, unless you've done that, then the assumption is that you cannot enter the temple. Now, I once actually gave a lesson where I went into this discussion about the sphere of holiness and the sphere of God and the sphere of man. And truthfully, the temple is this conjoining place where man enters a semi-reality of the presence of God. It's not the full presence of God, because the full presence of God, we saw what it did on Mount Sinai. But man enters, by entering the temple and preparing himself correctly, he has prepared himself. And when I say man, I mean men and women. They have prepared themselves correctly to enter the sphere of the holiness of the divine. And holiness cannot exist without being clean. The presence of something unclean actually causes holiness to go away. And for example, one of the things that I bring up every time I talk about Yom Kippurim, and we'll expand on this even more when we get to Acharei Mot, which deals with the Day of Atonement, I point out that the Day of Atonement is not a day where we only atone for our sins. The sacrifices used, especially the pouring of blood in different places, is actually an act of cleansing the temple. It's an act of removing impurities. That people can make mistakes and impurities might enter the temple. And what these impurities function as are blockages. They block the connection, the ability for man to enter the sphere of the divine. It pushes the sphere of the divine away. And we kind of see something like that in the book of Ezekiel. In Yehezkel, we hear about the Shekhinah, or actually they call it later on the Shekhinah, but really it's the word itself is a very, very late word. But the presence of God, or his abiding in the house in Jerusalem, is removed due to people's sins. And what I find very interesting is at the end of the book, so in the beginning of the book we have one thing, and then the end of the book we hear of a ceremony of sprinkling blood in the different sides of the temple as a preparation towards the high holiday there, which is probably Chag HaMatzot. And this opposite of what we see in the beginning of the book, a way of allowing the presence of God to actually be in the temple. So we, through our deeds and through our uncleanliness of entering the temple unclean, we actually cause the presence of God and the sphere of holiness to actually move away from our reality, and we need to act upon that to prevent that. So the act of Yom Kippurim is to remove any impurities and to cleanse the temple to enable the presence of God. It's not that the presence of God cannot exist there, but it's something, one may argue, educational for us, but to enable to reopen that blockage and reopen the pipes of spirituality to enter our world. And it's always been this idea of darashti kirvatecha, I seek your closeness. And there's, people can have a personal relationship with God and have a closeness with God anywhere they're at. But as a nation, we also have a place of gathering, which is the temple, and we have to keep maintenance of that place. And one of the elements of maintenance is also making sure that it's clean, that it's pure, and there's nothing affecting our connection with God. Now you might ask, what does all of this have to do with childbirth and the presence of God and so on? So first of all, let's think about it like this. God created life. And life was supposed to be near to God. That's basically the childbirth of mankind. However, man sinned and brought death upon himself. And death is sometimes symbolized by blood. And an idea that one might throw in here is that childbirth, though being a wonderful occasion and is something that represents a reenactment of the creation, that we actually as beings on this earth have the ability to bring life into reality, we are also told that it's tainted by death, and that the problem that came from what happened in the Garden of Eden, which some scholars, especially, for example, Israel Knoll brings this up in his book he has a book about several subjects, and one of them is the subject of the book of what happened in the book of Genesis. That one of the things that happened there, the tree of knowledge, is what we can call sexual knowledge, and that there's a corruption in this innocent and beautiful thing that is kept between a man and his wife, and the childbirth, the child labor, as it's mentioned in the book of Genesis, is an educator to us, that we need to realize that we have the potential, but yet we tainted it, and therefore we have to go through a process here There are a lot of complexities about this subject, which I really don't have the ability to dig in as much. But as a direction of thought, one must ask, why is this such a process considered to be unclean? And I think that that's a possible direction there. I mean, the whole idea of the menstrual cycle has to do with childbirth in general. Anyone who understands basic anatomy and understands where the cycle comes from knows that. So it's possible that the idea of uncleanliness here with childbirth and the cycle itself has to do with remembering the situation that mankind was in and educating us that you need to remember that you had the potential to be close to God, but yet you ruined it by not listening. And I don't want to step into places where some people might claim I'm sexist or something, so I'm going to be a little careful here, and not go beyond what I just said. But I think that that one of the very important elements in Torah as being an instruction and a way of changing ourselves to the better, that we need to sometimes seek in certain things an educational element. Yes, there's symbolism in everything. There's a meaning to everything. And sometimes we don't necessarily know. Because, for example, what is cleanliness and uncleanliness? We, as I said earlier, as humans, probably don't have the ability to fully comprehend the principle, what stands behind it. But we can sometimes find in between the lines an explanation that might give us, at least from our end, something that will allow us to know. And for those who listen to the programs I did on Genesis, one of the principles that Knoll actually brings up in his book is, and I think it's a book only in Hebrew, by the way, and it's a book that was actually very difficult to find. I was able to find a copy of it eventually after looking for it for quite a while. And one of the things that he points out there is that it seems to be that there's an element of trying to mature mankind in the story of Genesis, that mankind had to be punished, but yet he was given clothing to cover himself. That it wasn't through vengeance or something, sinister. It was really through an issue of, you have to learn now something, and I'm going to send you away from this garden that enables you to eat and drink and do whatever you want into the real world to cause you to mature. And when I look at human beings today, I see that as well. Some of us mature and some of us don't. So as a very short prayer here, I pray that we all reach a maturity that enables us to understand the Almighty and what He wants from us. Now, after this esoteric and I would say difficult idea to grasp, let's talk about the actual subject itself of childbirth. So first of all, one of the questions that is raised here is, what does it mean in verse 2? It says, Daber el bnei Israel, speak to the children of Israel, lemor, saying, Isha ki tazri'a. Now, what does it mean, Isha ki tazri'a? First of all, the word zera obviously means seed, so people automatically say, this means a woman has seed. So first of all, well, kind of, anyone who knows basic biology knows that this is true. But the problem with this is that in the ancient world, people really mostly conceived women as a vessel to contain the seed of the man, and not necessarily that women actually had any part in the actual production. Because, and I know this is a little weird, but this is some of the stuff that we hear from the ancient world. And what the Torah is doing here, it is not teaching us biology. This is a very important thing that people always forget. People think that everything is in the Bible, and this is a very, I would say, very Roman era and medieval way of thinking, that your religious texts and science kind of mix in together. In the ancient world, they actually believed that spirituality or spiritual concepts were part of science. Today, we actually separate spirituality and science. We actually, in the empiric work that people do, you actually separate between the parts. And for them, that was actually science. But in our case, the Torah is actually borrowing, and again, this feels a lot like Genesis to some degree. The Torah is actually borrowing out of the world of principles of agriculture. And there actually is work. I actually have a paper somewhere, I think even, about the principles of agriculture and how it affects the way people spoke Hebrew and other Semitic languages as well. And I actually want to quote here. I'll try to translate to the best of my ability from the Hebrew here. And it says the root of the word zera, as borrowed here, is actually taken from the agricultural word to indicate the birth of man, and therefore the offsprings of a man is his seed. This usage of the root is very common in the Bible, the root zera. The verb tazri'a is used here as in the book of Genesis when it says a grass which produces seed, as desha esav mazri'a zera. And this is Genesis 1:11. Meaning that the verb is actually being used to indicate the concept of birth. And therefore there is some kind of a double meaning here, for it says Tazri'a ve'yalda, meaning that it says that she seeds and she gives birth. And really what this writer is trying to say is that Tazri'a ve'yalda, we're not really looking here at necessarily a process of seeding and then giving birth, but that she's actually producing the offspring and then giving birth to it. So it's in the sense of the ability to give birth. But basically, what he says here, as he repeats, and as I can repeat it, he says, in the sense of the verb is to give birth, and therefore there is a double meaning here, as it says Tazri'a ve'yalda. And he points out that Unkelus and Pseudo Yonatan translate into Aramaic Tazri'a ta'idi, meaning that she conceives and becomes pregnant. And therefore, some may argue that the meaning here should be tizara, in the sense of she will be seeded. Now, whatever the case may be, I mean, there's this tendency to try to correct the vowel points of the Bible, and I understand what they're claiming here, but it's considered to be a very old way of looking at things. But the first point that he makes here is really the idea that Tazri'a is really in the sense of the ability to produce an offspring, and not that she has a seed or something like that. They didn't really perceive it that way. In any case, the thing that comes up here really is that in the ancient world, they believed that women functioned more like a basket, and that a woman would receive the seed from the man and then basically nurture it like the ground. But the man was really, that the child was really the offspring of the man, and that the woman was more like a vessel. Now today we know it's not true, it's not correct, but that might actually explain some of the idea that a person's genealogy really goes through the father, and that a person's name is that they're bearing the name of their father because they're really just a descendant of the father and not the mother. And that might explain the patriarchal understanding. It's possible that the matriarchal genealogy that shows up later on might have been through a latter understanding through medicine that came from Greece and Rome, that women actually do have a much more serious part in the production of a child, which opened up the possibility of a matriarchal genealogy instead of a patriarchal genealogy. In any case, so it says that she becomes, this is going back to chapter 2, to verse 2, it says, Vayeleda zachar, and she gives birth to a male, and she is unclean for 7 days. So 7 days is obviously a very known time of uncleanliness which appears several times in the Tanakh. In the Torah. And it says clearly, and she will be unclean as the days of her nidah, which is the davota, which is the the menstrual cycle itself. Now, what's very important to point out here at the moment, based on Pshat, the uncleanliness is only 7 days. And whatever happens later is not in that sphere of uncleanliness. Now, when we carry on through these verses, you understand more what I mean by this. But there actually is, in my opinion, a differentiation here between what is unclean inside your personal life and what's unclean when it comes to the temple. And this is a division that I think is literally the pshat. I don't agree with some of the ideas that are presented, especially by Karaites over this. And I think actually the rabbinic tradition about this is spot on. It's literally pshat. 7 days is a topological number, by the way, which means that the number here has a very symbolic meaning. And 7 days usually represents the end of a process. Usually in numerology of numbers in the Bible, that usually 7 represents that. And then it says, this is actually one of the few places where we hear about circumcision besides the commandment to Abraham and the fact that if you want to do a Passover, you have to be circumcised. And what we have here is the description of, they have to cut his basar. Now, besar orlato. This is a very interesting thing. One of the arguments about oral Torah, which I actually let me clarify this. I'm not rejecting oral Torah. Those who have listened to my series on oral Torah understand this. And there are people who become very defensive when I make comments like this, and you need to understand that if you come from an Orthodox background, then I understand the defensiveness. I come from an Orthodox background. I used to be defensive like this as well. But then when you start analyzing the type of arguments which are used in our circles, we realize that some of them are extremely flawed. One of the arguments made, and this is a classic argument in the Talmud, is that without oral Torah, we can't know how to do circumcision. Where do you circumcise? Now, besides the problem with the fact that circumcision is a very well-known practice and was practiced by neighbors of Israel, including the Edomites and the Egyptians, the usage of words actually gives away how things are done. Now, the meaning of words is to some degree a type of oral tradition, because how do you know what something means? You know it because you heard it from others and know the context, and this is how people speak all the time. The fact that someone puts it down in writing doesn't really change the fact that languages are, first of all, a spoken thing, and only secondary, it is a language which is represented by graphic images, or drawings, or symbols that we have a consensus of what they actually mean. So first of all, languages are spoken. They're only afterwards are written. Anyone who lives in any human environment, first of all, speaks, only learns to read and write if that system actually has reading and writing, if that person has access to reading and writing. Only afterwards do they actually come in contact with these things. And the word here, yimor, so first of all, the root mul. So it seems to be that it has to do with an act that has to do with circumcision. And everyone knows what milah, or the root mul, actually means. But if you want to add on to that, the word basar being used here is actually not the translation of the word meat or flesh. The word basar is used in several contexts throughout the Tanakh to indicate the male reproductive organ, specifically the actual organ itself, and not the testicles. Basically, the penis itself and not the testicles. Some people get a little queasy when you use terms like this, but we have to be kind of blunt about it. And the term itself, for example, appears in the book of Yehezkel, where it mentions the people from Egypt, which I think it says Egypt, there are gdilei basar, which are large of meat, which obviously indicates larger members. So it's very clear that the word yimol next to the word basar, there's no doubt what they're actually saying here. And the fact that someone at some time or had forgotten what these words actually mean and wants to rely only upon some kind of oral tradition he has, then, it's perfectly fine, but don't make the argument that we can't understand by just reading pshat what things mean. There's actually a discussion regarding how much Hebrew the sages actually knew, especially the Amoraim, at a time where Aramaic and Greek became more common, and Persian as well, and Hebrew became less and less of a spoken language. So if someone argues out of lack of knowledge, it doesn't mean that they actually know what they're talking about. I've had this many, many times, me doing it as well, but also others doing it to me, and I tell them, listen, the fact that you don't know, the fact that you've never read, doesn't mean that you're always in the right. You have some kind of a tradition, it's perfectly fine, I'm 100% with that, but take into consideration the possibility that your argument can be undercut by more knowledge, or that the type of argument that you're making can be undercut by more knowledge and more understanding. Lack of knowledge doesn't prove you're right. Lack of knowledge actually proves that you're lacking education. It doesn't mean that you'll be completely wrong, but the core of your argument might be flawed because you're misunderstanding something or you don't know something. So we have here this description of 7 days, and then we have 33 days. So first of all, think about it, 7 and 33, which is 40, which again is a very typological number, typological number, and it indicates 40, which is again the end of a process. It's also usually the end of a generation. 40 years is what's usually used to describe a generation. So this 7 and 40 are clearly very common numbers throughout the Tanakh. But the question is, why do we have the 7 and 33? And by the way, the same thing goes for the 14 for a girl, and then 66 days, which are basically doubling up the numbers, and it's 40 versus 80. Why 40 versus 80? We might try to answer that in a moment, but what is the difference between these 7 days and these 33 days? And the text really actually gives it away. It says that for 7 days she's unclean as the uncleanliness of her nidah, which is always has to do with are the husband and wife allowed to come in contact with one another on a sexual level? Because the prohibition of nidah acts in two spheres. It acts in not being allowed to come in contact with anything in the sphere of holiness, and then also not being allowed to come into the sphere of her husband or the sphere of a mundane life at home. Now, do you need to prevent the woman from coming in contact with things in the house and telling her to sit only in a certain place and use only very specific tools and not touch the food and everything? Again, it depends on the level of what the person or the household is trying to keep. We hear stories of rabbis and sages and different people in Jewish history, and even people who are not Pharisees, and that made sure that they never come in contact with something which is unclean. I won't be surprised if people who are temple servants, such as Kohanim and Leviim, or people who volunteer in the temple, kept these rules more strictly in their homes. But if we're talking about some farmer who lives in whatever valley, and he doesn't come to the temple more than the 3 times he has to show up, but maybe once in several months, then who says he has to keep this in his home? So then the question is raised, what is this 33-day thing? So it's clear that when she is nidah, temple is out of the picture, anything which is holy has to be out of the picture, and coming in contact with her husband is out of the picture. That's clear. But then we have, it says, U'shloshim yom v'shloshet yamim teshev b'dmei tahara. This term, Dmei Tahara, is considered to be a very difficult term. So for 33 days, she will sit on this blood of something. And it clearly states, Bechol kodesh lo tiga, ve'lamikdash lo tavod melot yemei tahara. Here, it doesn't use the term nidah, which has a very specific meaning in the language of the book of Leviticus. It actually states you will not touch anything which is kodesh. Kodesh is, again, a term that has to do with things which are sacrificed, or sacrifices, or anything that belongs into the temple sphere. Because remember this, you can't say something which is holy. That's too abstract It's too general in the English language. And the principle of holiness might be a little different than what Westerners understand. Or what English has the ability to convey, I think, would be a much better term to use here, because when you say something is kodesh in the world of the West, which is mostly predominantly Christian, holy doesn't mean the idea that there are laws that also prohibit you from coming in contact with it. That, for example, if you keep the sanctity of the place, it means you don't do certain acts there, or that behaving in a certain way is inappropriate, therefore you're doing sacrilege. But what we're talking about here, that there's actually a physical manifestation here that actually has rules to it. And it's different than what we find in Western culture. But it says, B'chol kodesh lo tiga. Kodesh is a term which means this is something that belongs into the temple sphere, and actually usually means something which is a sacrifice or a trumah, for example, something which is given to the Kohanim as tithe from the land. And the term tithe, I'm using it very loosely here. It's not really a tithe. It's not the same principle. And or a sacrifice that the family would bring, like a Thanksgiving or a peace offering. For example, if the wife gives birth and they want to celebrate it, so they go to a local shrine, or if they travel all the way to the temple, and the father wants to celebrate the fact that he has a child born, and he might bring a sacrifice and not wait for the wife to be clean so they can celebrate with everyone else. And therefore, in a situation like that, the wife is not allowed to come near to the temple or to eat from that sacrifice. And that's really the second thing. V'la mikdash lo tavo. And she will not enter the temple. She's not allowed to come to the temple. Now, if you think about the reality of living near the tabernacle, this becomes even more clear, because in the reality of the tabernacle, we see that the tabernacle is nearby, and therefore bringing a sacrifice or coming in contact with things that have to do with the temple is much easier than a reality where there are either central shrines or one central shrine, which obviously creates limitations of how much contact you actually come with the temple. And it says, Ad yemei melot yemei tahara. So this term, dmei tahara, I would say it is negating or it is standing as an opposite to the principle of nida. In nida, she is forbidden from everything. In the dmei tahara, this is not pure blood. If she's still bleeding, it's not pure blood in the sense that there is such a thing as blood which is clean and blood which is unclean, but more in the sense that in opposition to the principle of the nida, there are elements in the dmei tahara which do make her clean. So it's not, for example, dmei tahara in the sense that she has to wait, so for example, some Karaite commentators, I think, say this, that it is blood that she has to wait to purify herself, but it's actually blood that has elements in it which do not make her unclean in that, in the sense of what she's allowed to do in the sphere of her own home. That she is allowed to be in contact with her husband. Now, obviously, anyone who's ever had children knows that takes time, and there's damage that happens, and but the idea is that it's possible that when, even back then, when a husband and wife, when the wife was in the process, when it was in the middle of her cycle, they weren't allowed to even touch one another, under the possibility that they might do something that they're not supposed to do. So they actually, the Torah might be hinting here to restriction that when the wife is unclean, they need to keep space between them. And now, at this point, now they're allowed to touch, and they're allowed to hug, and he's allowed to come and contact her on a more romantic level. And in my opinion, that's pshat. But to be clarified regarding Jewish practice today the understanding is that any blood is unclean because we don't have the ability to differentiate from one type of blood to the other. I have a lot of questions about that understanding. It assumes certain things which I don't necessarily think are scriptural. But in any case, I don't think anyone really wants to come in contact on that level with his wife when they're. I don't think the wife is interested either because it's hemorrhaging and there's injuries and everything. I don't think anyone really goes that direction anyhow. Now, the difference between a boy and a girl has always been discussed amongst different commentators. Why do we have this difference? What is this difference here? And there are different answers, and I have not been convinced by any of them. Most of it has been guesswork. For example, one of the answers I saw was that she's really sitting to be unclean for the daughter as well, because she's female, and she also has the potential of she has the future potential of giving birth and having a cycle and everything, that we double up the time to kind of like atone for her, quote unquote, atone for her as well, as the mother takes responsibility for the daughter. I think that's mostly guesswork. I don't think there actually is a clear answer for any of it. And some people go and say, there might be there might be some kind of superstition here. Some people want to argue. There really is no. I don't think there really is any answer that we have. I'm actually kind of staring at a book here, trying to see if they're saying anything. But really, everyone just speculates about this, and there's no. There really is no answer for this thing. I mean, some people might throw answers. There might be someone who came up with an answer somewhere. I'm completely unaware of it, but I've read a lot of literature about this, and I have not been convinced by any of it. Now, as the final process here of giving birth to a child, there actually is now a sacrifice. Now, what's interesting here is these are sacrifices brought by doves. You have to bring a dove, not a full-fledged gigantic sacrifice, because really, this is not for sin. And if you want to bring a thanksgiving, it's done a different way. But what's very interesting here is that one sacrifice is an olah, and the other sacrifice is a chatat. And you start thinking, okay, an olah I can understand; it's some kind of offering, and it's a natural thing that maybe people will bring to a temple, a completely burnt sacrifice as coming before God, or anything of that sort. But then the question is, why a chatat? Now, we mostly associate ourselves with the word chatat to indicate, that there's a sin. And everyone always asks this question, did she sin here? And someone actually asked me, I think it was like a day or two ago, someone asked me, why does Aaron bring in his sacrifices from last week's parasha, why is one of them a chatat? Why does he actually bring a sin offering? So there are two possibilities I see here. One possibility is that there might be some kind of a retrospect thinking about the sin of Adam and Eve, and this is part of our process as mankind to atone for the sin of Adam and Eve. Maybe. Another possibility here is maybe unintentional sin. She might have caused something to become unclean during that time, or that there might be some kind of a mistake that was made somewhere along the lines. I mean, there's even a place where they say she might have said something during the childbirth that during the labor pains that might be considered to be a sin, or she might have made a promise that she didn't intend. A lot of different possibilities here. But we also have to think about the level of the impurity itself. This is considered to be a serious impurity. And this might be a way of not atoning, but really cleansing more than anything else. That we're going back to that principle of cleansing the temple and not necessarily atoning for a sin. But we actually have a lot of questions when it comes to these acts. That there are places where we find sacrifices that, under the specific name that they have, they don't necessarily make sense here. For example, if it would have said the word asham, I would have said, okay, that's clearly for a sin. The word chatat is mostly associated with the principle of sin, or actually I would say is associated with the principle of sin, but then we also need to think about another principle that comes with it, which is the idea of cleansing. Again, these are all thoughts and ideas. We actually have a gap in certain places that I'm not very convinced that we can explain them at the moment. the other thing that comes up as well when it comes to children, and this is not something which appears here in the text. What do you do with children? What was the reality of children back then? And from what we know, children probably were under the supervision of the mother. And we'll expand about this more when I get around to doing the recording over about child education with my wife. But it seems to be that children mostly were under the mother till around the age of 5. The mother usually was the one that told them how to speak and told them basic life properties around the household. In other words, the basic education of a child was usually on the mother, because the father in most families had to be outside all day working. But the moment the child was old enough, they assume it was around the age of 5 or 6, the child actually would join the father. And the father from that point onwards, though the child is still a child and at the end of the day still returns to his mother and tells his mother everything he went through, the child from a very young age is educated in the ways of the world, which is very different than what we do today. Today, children are allowed to be children to a very, very late age. And again, this is as we start off with the whole thing about cultures, and we're going to end with the whole subject of cultures, that today in our culture, we're very childish. I actually personally had to mature very, very quickly because of different things that happened in my personal life. But I meet a lot of Americans, for example, and I'm not dissing on Americans, don't take me wrong here, but it just happened to be with Americans quite a bit. That I meet these teens or these late teens or these young adults, and they can be very knowledgeable and very smart because of sometimes the education they receive and everything. But then when I look at people when they're in their 20s and their 30s, and they go out and they want to party and they want to drink and they want to do different things. For me, as a person who mentally is a lot more mature, I know that drinking those quantities of beer or getting drunk every once in a while, or even a relatively frequent basis, and always trying to put that part of life over others, does show that there is something wrong with the education. I'm not saying there's something wrong with having fun. This is the thing. I am actually very pro-fun and very pro-telling jokes and going out and having a good time. But I see a problem that always happens with people that come more from Western culture is that there's always this pursuit, or I would say there's always this internal contradiction where on the one hand you can show serious maturity in certain places, on the other hand you completely forget who you are. And I think that really stems from the difference of education then and now, and education in more traditional cultures versus what we have in Western culture. And then people might dub this Yoel's attack on Western culture. And you know what? I want to be critical of Western culture the same way Western culture is sometimes critical of my culture. So if you're gonna dish it, you also have to receive it sometimes. And the thing that I think that goes on here is that Western culture tends to pamper children for a very, very long time. That he's protected and considered to be a child to a very late age. And that children are not expected to, and I'm not saying this happens in every house, by the way, to be very clear. I have a lot of friends in the United States who their children are educated from a very young age to work and do things and so on. But what I see by most with a lot of people, because again, I can know people like this and people like that. Someone said to me, I've never met that. Well, I've met of everything. It happens a lot. The people are limited by whatever they're exposed to. And the thing that I started noticing is that Western culture is becoming even more and more severe in this. I'm seeing more and more of a intensity in this, is that people are treated as children to a much later age, and they are taught to have, everything that they want and need. And I'm not talking about poor families, because in poor families you have no choice. The child has to start doing things from a very early age. But I'm saying more, lower middle class all the way to upper class, where people want to continue being children for a very, very long time. And in the ancient world, a child by the age of 5 or 6 was already working in the fields with the father, because that was education back then. You need to learn your profession. We didn't have education like we have today, where we admire knowledge, abstract knowledge, and things like that. They actually had to, first of all, learn how to be in the real physical world. And I think that is a trait that we find in the Torah everywhere, that we're, first of all, grounded in the real world, and only afterwards do we start educating ourselves in more spiritual or more abstract thought that we can develop. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this recording. I know that was slightly bouncing around between different subjects here, a little bit, because there's some philosophy here. Every time you deal with the idea of cleanliness and uncleanliness and trying to explain it, my mind always, while talking, my mind tries to find things that I might have not thought of earlier in this. And while talking, sometimes things come to mind, and it becomes a little bit more complex sometimes. And it is very difficult to grasp some of these ideas. Even if you're well educated in this field, there are some very abstract ideas which are a little bit more difficult to grasp and a little bit more difficult to explain. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this recording. And again, this is a tricky subject, so if you have any comments or ideas, I am more than open to hear them, because I, to this very day, after years of studying this material, still trying to grasp certain ideas, and you sometimes hear from someone else and it really clicks something and you understand something you didn't see earlier. So in any case, if you're listening to this during just before Shabbat, may you have a Shabbat Shalom. If you're listening during Shabbat, so Shabbat Shalom as well. And again, don't forget to go to my website, HebrewInIsrael.net, Facebook page, Hebrew in Israel. Don't forget to leave comments, like, and share. As I always say, sharing is caring. It enables others to know, and that's how we spread knowledge. In any case, Kol Tov.